Welcome, everyone. Good to see you all again. If this is your first time joining us, welcome, and we're excited to have you here. As many of you guys know, the purpose of this project is to help us all support employees' mental health, especially in the nursing home settings and assisted living facilities. We really want to help supervisors build up their capacity to recognize when employees are starting to experience or show signs and symptoms of burnout or compassion fatigue, and give you guys some strategies on how to address that with them. We're also hoping to give you guys your own self-care strategies to increase your own personal resilience. Today's session is kind of focused more on our supervisor training framework that we use. So how do we authentically communicate with our staff? Please note that there are many different types of leadership styles. We just felt that the authentic leadership strategies really lent itself well to mental health. So Linda's going to do a little presentation on what that looks like in practice. You can receive credit for this session today. We offer social work contact hours. So to receive credit, please fill out the evaluations and stay on for the whole call. And we'd love to hear your thoughts during the case presentation when we get to that portion of the session today. And we'll go ahead and get started with some introductions. I am Krista Opstal. I'm the Project ECHO Director here at NDCPD at Minot State University. Kyle, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yep. I am Kyle Erickson. I am the evaluator for Project ECHO here at Minot State University.
And I'm Jody Patchen. I'm the support for Project ECHO at MSU.
And we also have Jessica Reiswig on our team, but she is not able to join us today. So just want to give her a shout out as well. And I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Linda Cressup. Dr. Cressup is the Director of Master of Science in Sports Management Program at Minot State. She teaches classes in leadership communications, organizational collaboration, and business communication. She also coordinates the Prior Learning Assessment Program in the College of Business. Dr. Cressup is a peer reviewer for the Higher Learning Commission and an international associate of collegial business education. So I totally butchered that word.
Okay. Okay.
So thank you. Go ahead and take over if you want to share your screen.
Okay, I will share my screen with you and hopefully you can get this to look the right way. Okay, thank you, Krista. As Krista said, I'm Dr. Linda Cressup and I teach leadership communication in the College of Business. It's actually, I also teach that class as lead in the lead area for the leadership area at Minot State. And I actually am no longer the director of the sports management program. I took over the graduate school last year, so I spun that role off to someone else so that I could focus on graduate school, which I did 10 years ago, and then I came back, I guess. So today what we're talking about is leadership communication styles, specifically authentic leadership, but that's not actually the main. It's a focus later on in the session, but it's not the main focus, because in order to understand leadership, authentic leadership, we have to understand leadership. So we'll be talking about leadership communication styles, approaches to leadership, authentic leadership, and then communication strategy, because if you don't have a strategy, you can't really be successful in the rest of it. So to get started, leadership is at the core of the human experience. You can read the slide. I won't read them to you, but strategy. So back to where I was when I babbled away. Leadership is a universal, it receives universal attention. There's many theorists out there always trying to determine how we lead each other and how leadership affects one another, both leaders and followers. Followers prosper under effective leaders and they suffer under ineffective leaders. If you stop for a moment and think, you can all think of your experience when you had a really good leadership experience and when you had a not so great leadership experience. And if you think about those experiences, at the core of them was communication. Leadership cannot happen without communication. It doesn't have to be verbal communication. It can be nonverbal communication. So any kind of communication is going to be tied into leadership. Specifically, leadership communication includes a willingness to communicate, storytelling as a leader, and storytelling is a key to any leadership experience, because as you tell a story, you involve people's emotions and you get them involved in your situation, and you can prompt them to learn a lesson just by telling that story. Emotional communication competencies, we're all familiar with emotional intelligence, or most of us have heard about emotional intelligence, paying attention to ourselves, self-awareness, awareness of our relationships with others, including between people and among people in dyads and larger groups and even organizations. Impression management, making sure that when we communicate, we're leaving the impression that we intended to. And then at the end of it all, communication strategy, which is actually the beginning. If we don't strategize what we're going to say or do, we don't often, we're not as successful with our communication. So you may be familiar with the two main models of leadership communication. Most of us have heard about the authoritarian, the democratic, and the laissez-faire models, which authoritarian is that strict, you're going to do it my way, here's the policy, here's the procedure, here's the behavior, this is how it works. Most of us don't want to identify with authoritarian. Some areas it's necessary. Some jobs just have to be led by a leader who has that style. Democratic is where we all want to be. We all want to be that leader who shares and supports their followers, has some supportive communication, facilitates the development of others. And then laissez-faire, of course, is kind of a non-leadership. In laissez-faire leadership, we don't really have a lot of leadership going on, and we've probably experienced that type of leadership as well. Any of these works, depends on the situation and what's necessary. As we've moved forward, starting probably in the 60s, which now sounds like a long time ago. And I tell my students I've been here for 38 years, so 60, they don't even understand what the 60s or 70s or 80s were about. But moving forward, we tried to get away from the authoritarian, the democratic, and laissez-faire, and we started talking more in terms of task and interpersonal, which are more straightforward, right? We have leaders who really focus on the task, and those leaders are actually acting in more of a management role. And we have leaders who are more interpersonal, where they're focusing on the people. So this chart breaks down the two and gives you just kind of an overview of what task versus interpersonal orientations are all about. Task, again, disseminates the information, focuses on the facts, the data, the information. Often the communication is most often in writing. We emphasize completing the task through the acquisition of skills. We often make demands if we're task oriented. Versus interpersonal, where we solicit opinions from others. We focus on feelings, emotions, and attitudes, and we communicate more often orally. We take advantage of that opportunity to get that instant feedback. There's emphasis on productivity through acquisition of personal skills. So again, we want you to produce, but we want you to learn as you produce that particular artifact. And then we make requests rather than demands. And I believe Krista gave all of you a couple of worksheets to walk through. And one of them was a questionnaire on your task and your interpersonal orientation. Is that correct? Can somebody let me know that you had those and you did them?
I'm putting them in the chat right now.
Oh, okay. Well, let me give you a moment when you get those. Maybe take a moment to look through those and maybe fill them out. Do we have time, Krista, for them to look those over and do a quick run through?
Yep. Please let me know if you guys have any issues accessing them.
So if you'll just open that and just quickly run through and assess yourself. I don't know how much time I can afford to give you. A couple of minutes. I did them myself this morning and had not what I thought my result would be. Oh, I see somebody can't get to it. Okay, it looks like the worksheet is not coming up for everyone. So okay. I'll just briefly go over it. So in the, Krista can probably provide it to you afterwards and you can take a look at it. What the worksheet does is gives you an opportunity to assess yourself on a variety of areas to determine if you're task or interpersonal oriented. So for example, a question is tells group members what they're supposed to do. If you're task oriented, you're going to score that highly. Acts friendly with members of group. If you're interpersonal oriented, you're going to score that highly. So as you go through that worksheet, when you have an opportunity to look at it, you will see that all of the evens, all the odd numbers associate with task, all the even numbers associate with interpersonal. And I ran through it again this morning. I hadn't done it for a while, and I found that I got the same score for both sides, which makes complete sense to me, because on the interpersonal orientation side, I'm a faculty member, so I teach students. And so of course, in teaching, I'm focusing more on their feelings and emotions, their attitudes, their personal growth. I like to communicate with them more orally than in writing, which is why I love my on-campus class versus I love my online as well, but online is a lot more difficult because it becomes task-oriented, which is not the way I want to operate. On the other side, I am an administrator, so I tend to maybe behave a little bit more task-oriented in that side of the types of things that we do, mainly because we have to get things done. So it wasn't necessarily surprising that I scored high on both. It was surprising that I had the exact same score on both. So it'll be interesting for you to go through and see which direction you tend to score higher on. If you're an authentic leader, you'll likely score higher in the interpersonal orientation. Krista, did you want me to stop if there were any questions in the
Yes,
chat?
so
I'm not really following it.
I just added 2 new links to Dropbox. So do we want to give everyone a second to see if they can download it? Angie said that she was able to access the first one.
Oh, okay. Maybe skip the first one and go ahead and move on to the authentic one, because we'll get to that in just a few minutes. If you'd like me to give everyone a few minutes to fill those out.
Okay, I'm gonna put a little emoji next to the second one that I just added right before
Great.
Angie's comment.
Okay, and then I
Sorry
will
about
just
that,
give you a
guys.
couple of moments. Heavens, I'll answer my phone while you're filling that out. Maybe someone give me a thumbs up or something. Kyle, can you let me know when when you think people have had enough time to fill them out?
And just so everybody knows, these are in iEcho. Anytime you go to the schedule, you should be able to see content where you can download it from there as well. Either through like the schedule tab under the current session, or if you go over to content, it's all there so you can download it. It looks like these are PDFs, so I don't think people will be able to fill them out online, but you could definitely take a look at them because
Okay, we'll just move along then, and we'll talk about them when we get to them. Okay, thank you for clarifying that for me. Okay, so in addition to having leadership styles, there are different approaches that we take when we're leading, and people are identified basically by these different approaches. The first 5 of them are kind of the old school traditional approaches to leadership. The traits approach, which is based on physical and psychological characteristics that predispose one to have leadership influence. And later, so initially those predispose you to be influential. Later on, you become identified by the traits approach based on identified cognitive abilities and approaches to how you do things, your locus of control, your personality, those kinds of things. A situational approach is kind of it depends on what the situation is. So you may become a leader in one situation and not in another one. And the way you handle that situation is based on the situation itself. The functional approach is a combination of traits and situational. So you have those skills and abilities to be a leader, but it's also situational in the fact that you may apply them at that particular situation, or you may not need to. Skills approach goes back to identifying those abilities. We all have certain abilities that make us maybe more successful as a leader versus someone else. And then relational starts segueing into the more modern approaches to leadership, which is kind of ignoring those skills and tasks and abilities and focusing more on your interpersonal skills with other people. So that takes us then into transformational, and transformational is kind of the umbrella term that focuses on changing. When you think of transforming, you think of changing. A transformational approach to leadership is someone who takes the approach of being more open and collaborative, inspiring, intellectually stimulating, creative, has a vision. Vision is a key for transformational. And within transformational, there are two approaches that actually come to the top: charismatic, and we've all heard of that charismatic leader. If you think of different leaders out there, the one that is in all the textbooks is John Kennedy. Barack Obama is another one that's identified as being charismatic. Charismatic leaders are the superstars. A lot of celebrities are considered charismatic because they just have a presence that draws us to them. They are visionary, they are creative, they kind of have this almost lightning effect on us. And it's a little bit difficult to describe, but charismatic leaders share with authentic leaders some of those same approaches or some of those same traits as far as being very open and authentic in what they say and do. Let me switch slides here. Okay, so let's talk about authentic leadership. I almost said athletic. I teach students who are athletes, so athletic leadership. Authentic leaders, the focus is on the strengths of the individual. So we're not focusing so much on our tasks, but we're focusing on the interpersonal, our self-awareness and what we as a person know of ourselves and how we carry that forward in working with others. When you think about authentic leaders demonstrate a passion for their purposes and their practices and their values. They're consistent with what they value, and they hold firm to their own personal values, yet they listen to others and are able to walk others through processes with the other person in mind. Authentic leaders lead from the heart, which isn't a bad thing, but they also lead from their head. So they have a balance of paying attention to feelings and behaviors. They establish long-term meaningful relationships with their followers, and they have a self-discipline to meet those results. They know who they are, basically. An authentic leader knows who they are. And when you take that authentic leadership, the questionnaire that I sent to you, when you take that and you assess yourselves, you may be surprised at the results. I know when I went through mine again this morning, I was surprised that I scored a little higher on some and a little lower on others that I thought I should have scored higher on. But being honest and filling it out, I thought, oh, I thought I was better at this than I am. So you may be a little surprised. If you look at this slide, then there are 3 parts of authentic leadership, actually 4. The authentic behavior, which is adhering to your own personal values and resisting that outside pressure to change. And depending on your situation, that's difficult to not succumb to outside or external pressure. The balanced processing is being able to listen to others' points of view and thoughts fairly and consider those, as well as sharing your own thoughts. So creating that balance between what your opinion might be and what someone else's might be, especially in a decision-making situation. And in the types of positions that you're in, I'm sure that comes into play quite often, listening to the issues with the people whom you supervise. Relational transparency is presenting one's true self to others. So there's no hidden background, there's no hidden agenda. This is who I am. This is my true authentic self. And then self-awareness, being aware of your own personal values, having an honest and accurate view of your own strengths and weaknesses. One of the questions in the questionnaire asks about, do you accept who you are? Do you accept how you defined yourself? Can you accept that? And that's interesting in that I stopped when I read that one and thought, well, that's an interesting question to ask myself. I hadn't really thought of anything in that regard before. So just a quick quote I was going to share with you about authentic leaders. And this comes from Bill George and Peter Sims, who wrote the book True North, Discovering Your Authentic Leadership. They said our authentic leaders are marked by a keen self-awareness and deeply held values that enable them to lead with empathy. And that's a key word in here, leading with empathy. They recognize, share, support the goals of their followers. Very, very important that we think about the followers when we when we're looking at authentic leadership. Okay, so just a couple more thoughts about authentic leadership. They promote feelings of self-efficacy, hope, and optimism and resilience with their followers. Followers are key, right? They're the people that are working with us to make us leaders. Followers have increased job performance due to higher, my slide is in my way here. Whoops, didn't mean to do that. Let me back up one. Okay. Because they're believing in themselves and you're believing in them. Followers have higher commitment to their position. And authentic leadership is often a combination of transformational and servant. And remember, before I said transformational is kind of that umbrella term for change. And the authentic leader carries not only those characteristics of a transformational leader, but those specific true to self, self-awareness characteristics. Servant, either way. Servant leadership is paying specific attention to the follower, putting the follower first, putting your employee before you, and really attending to their needs. And so authentic leaders have a combination of both. At this point, I was going to have you rate yourself as an authentic leader, so you can give yourself a guess. You can, before you go through and look at that survey. Some of the questions that are asked on the survey are things like, I can list my 3 greatest weaknesses. If you can do that, then you're probably going to score highly on that self-awareness area. I do not allow group pressure to control me. Other people know where I stand on controversial issues, and so on. There's a number of questions on there. There's 16, and you score yourself in the areas of self-awareness, of internalized moral perspective, of balanced processing, and of rational transparency. So how do you become an authentic leader? You have to know yourself. You have to know who you are, and you need to be committed to knowing yourself and to developing yourself, your self-awareness of who you are and what you're all about. You need to learn to connect with others, and in connecting with others, that means listening to others, which is number 4, making sure that you're hearing what they say, that you're truly listening and not and processing what's being said. Being discreet, and that I'm sure is a top criteria for you anyway, given the fields that you're in. Listening, of course, playing to your strengths. Where are you strong? Where are you not so strong? And requesting feedback, always asking others for feedback. Okay, and at the end, applying that basic communication strategy when you're connecting with others. And so I'm going to probably, for some of you, go back in time and talk about this communication process. Communication process is communication is circular. In other words, the message that the message that's encoded goes to the receiver, who decodes it, and it goes around and around. And those message and feedback messages have all kinds of interruptions and barriers. So you're used to you're probably familiar with the communication process of sender, receiver, message, and then all the barriers that come into play. And this is important because as you're speaking to those people and you're trying to put forward your best authentic approach to leadership, you want to be thinking about, how do I encode a message that's going to be what the receiver is going to decode it as, making sure that it's the same exact message. So this is important because it's all upon you as the authentic leader to encode the message correctly. If you don't, then obviously the message on the other end is not going to be perceived as the way it was supposed to be. So the strategy itself contains five steps. And I always tell my students, it's really difficult to do this, but if you can sit back the first few times after you listen to this presentation, and before you communicate, walk yourself through this process, you'll start to think about this more frequently when you're creating correspondence, when you're having an oral communication, an oral conversation with someone, thinking through the steps before you actually have the conversation. And we all know that we don't always do those kinds of things. In fact, most of us don't take time to think through this process. But to be an authentic leader, it's important that you go through the strategy so that you can actually know your audience and know the best way to communicate. So the first thing, obviously, is to know what the objective of the message is. Why are you sending this message to begin with? Why are you having this conversation? Are you telling? Are you selling? Are you providing information? Are you persuading? And what credibility do you have with that person who's receiving your message? Obviously, if you're an authentic leader, your credibility should be high. But thinking through, as we're building that credibility and building that trust with our audience, what level are you at? If I were to choose the most important of the strategies, it would be the audience. always assess your audience. Who are they and what do they already know and what do they expect? How do they feel about what you're saying? How are they going to accept the message that you give to them? If you're, for example, laying someone off of their job, what is their reaction going to be? So anticipating how they're going to feel so that you can empathize with them when that message is given to them is important in that strategy. The message itself, direct and indirect approach. And I always tell my students, indirect is that bad news and direct is the good news. If you're telling someone they got an A in the class, you want to say, congratulations, you've earned an A. If they've got an F, you want to explain how they got to the F before you tell them they got the F, because they're not necessarily going to read the message if you tell them up front. So the message, generally when you're giving some bad news to someone, you kind of bury the bad news a little ways down after you explain why. And again, thinking about your audience, it might be that this particular audience isn't going to accept that type of an approach. They want it direct. How will the audience still continue to listen to you when you get to that middle point, which is kind of where we're at now. You probably heard the very beginning of my presentation. You'll probably remember the end of the presentation, but this stuff in the middle sometimes is where we get lost, because that's where we kind of fade away. So thinking about that message for your audience and how are you going to keep them attending to what you're saying? And then, of course, the channel, what's the best way to communicate? The authentic leader tends to communicate more in that interpersonal way, oral messages versus written messages when possible. And then cultural, what kinds of diversity do you have in your audience? And diversity is everything. What makes people different? And so anything that might affect them. The class that I teach right now has 11 students in it, and they're from 9 different countries. And so it's really interesting when we were talking about a particular case study last night, and everyone was taking the side that the manager in the case was a very poor leader, was not an authentic leader in any stretch of the imagination. And one person pointed out, but remember what culture he's from. In his culture, this is perfectly appropriate. And it stopped everybody in their tracks, because he was right. He was right. And so we had to kind of step back and reassess what we were saying about the particular case, although we did agree in the end that he did it wrong anyway. But so communication strategy being very important. Okay, so applying your knowledge, what are we going to do with all this stuff that I've just talked about? First of all, you need to identify your primary leadership style. Are you, and I think I would not go back to authoritarian and democratic and laissez-faire, but rather, are you task, are you interpersonal, are you a combination of the two? And being able to honestly identify when is one type of style more prevalent than the other. Authentic is going to probably be more when you're interpersonal. But there are times when task is more important. Consider how you approach leadership. And this is where we get into being an authentic leader. So are you transformational? Are you moving forward? Are you actually a charismatic leader, like some of our famous people, right? Charismatic, we always think of the movie star, don't we? Or the politician. What we want to do is approach that authenticity, which is why we're working towards it in our leadership styles. And I think you'll find when you fill out the questionnaire that I sent to you, or the survey, you will find you'll be able to identify where you are and where you need to improve your skills in which of the areas. And then always consider that communication strategy, because if you consider that, that will take you a step forward in your communication itself. So thinking about that, and that will help you with the empathy that you need to have as an authentic leader. And I believe that's the end of my presentation, but I'd be open for questions, or you may need to segue into your case study.
We have time for questions. We do have time for questions if anybody has any. You can put them in the chat, or feel free to unmute if you're comfortable.
I will stop sharing.
I really appreciated the crafting your message. I think I might actually print that out on a slide and put that on my computer, because there's so many times where I don't consider the audience when I'm crafting the message, and I make a lot of assumptions that people kind of know what's coming out of my brain without, fully explaining that. So I think that was a really good, just take a moment and be more mindful in how you're crafting these communications with everybody.
And truly, to be an authentic leader, you have to stop and take that step back and think through how you're going to communicate before you actually do it. That'll help you in that step to becoming more authentic in how you lead your people.